All right. Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Raymond Lee, and I'm with Careerminds, the sponsor of today's webinar titled Positioning Your People to Pursue Growth. In just a bit, I'm going to introduce Steve Miller, our presenter, but just a couple of housekeeping items as folks are starting to enter in. Welcome, everyone. As you're coming in here, everyone's been put on mute. So throughout today's session, we are going to be using the chat feature. Many of you have already kind of chatted in where you're dialing in from. If you're just joining, please join in to let us know where you're calling in from this afternoon. So if you have any questions throughout today's session, please use the chat. You can message Steve direct. You can message the panelists. I'll be monitoring the chat. Or you can publish your questions or comments to everyone. So we'd like to keep this as interactive as possible, so please do that. And then secondly, we are obviously recording this webinar, and we'll plan to send out a follow-up email with a copy of the presentation, a link to the recording, so you'll be receiving that additional information. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our introduction to Steve, who's going to be presenting today. And just a little context here, I met Steve last year at the SHRM conference as he and I were both speaking on the same day. And we were sitting in the speaker's lounge having some coffee, I think getting ready for our talks. And we just started sharing the work that we're doing. And coincidentally, we had just a lot of common threads between the work that we're doing. And since then, we've become fast friends. And most recently, Steve was just incredibly grateful to help me launch my new podcast that actually dropped yesterday, where Steve, he interviewed me for the first 3 shows. So really excited about that. And we'll share some information about how to access that in the chat. So a little bit more about Steve. He's an ICF PCC certified executive coach. And he's coached high performers for over 2 decades now, such as elite athletes, business owners, executives, emerging leaders. And as the owner of the Career Competitor Coaching, Steve oversees coaching and workshop facilitation that ensures clients invest in their optimal selves when pursuing optimal performance. As a speaker, it's Steve's mission to educate, equip, and empower audiences to make lasting investments in their own personal growth, performance mindset, and cultural development. He's authored the book, Shock the World, which you have to get. It's a fantastic read. I would encourage that. He's also a podcast host and a devoted husband. And he's a committed, embarrassing dad to his children. And I think that's self-proclaimed, Steve. You can comment on that if you'd like.
No one's provided me the award just yet, but I'm sticking to it.
I see your LinkedIn posts, and they're probably like, Dad, did you really post that?
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, and just finally, Steve is the coach who realizes his potential by helping you realize yours. And so with that, Steve, super grateful that you're carving out your time with us this afternoon, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, Raymond, thank you for that. The pleasure is all mine. I've been looking forward to this now. We've had this on the books for 3 or 4 months, and
yep.
I think for me, the thing I'm probably most excited about today is that part of my introduction there with the educate, the equip, and the empower. Because wherever you find yourself currently on your growth journey, I think what you're going to find out of today is that if you're far along with it, this will be something that can educate you a little bit more. If you feel like you're sort of in the middle and in some sort of transition, I feel as I'm going to be able to educate you a little bit. And if you're completely new to the concept of growth, as we go through this today, you're going to feel pretty equipped to get going, just get out of the starting gates. And that's the thing you're going to learn with me as we go through the next 45, 50 minutes is I'm such an advocate for just getting started, because it's the one thing as people, for the most part, we have one of the hardest things to do is just to get started. And you'll see here in just some of the areas that we're going to focus on today, How can we make growth authentic? I.e., how do we make it something that feels as though it's coming from you and not from some sort of outside influence? Secondly, looking at this ability to justify adversities, what would it be like to actually go through an adversity where you say, I'm actually going through this for a reason and it's not coming at me, it's not happening to me? And then start to think about honoring the work, getting so connected with the work that comes with growth that one might argue that it's not even considered work. And then finally, establishing a lasting foundation. And for someone who's been operating in high performance as long as I have, a foundation for growth is absolutely pivotal. And that is where we're going to spend the majority of our time here this afternoon or this morning, wherever you might be tuning in from. But before we get too far along here, what I want to do is I just want to get a feeling who I'm talking to today. So in the chat, I'd love to get A, B, or C from you. When I say growth mindset, for instance, do you live growth mindset? Do you sort of know what it's about? Maybe read a few books here or there? Or do I say that and you just go, come again? I'm not really sure exactly what it is you're getting to here, Steve. So in the chat, real quick, I'd love to see where we relate with growth mindset. Right. So decent amount of B's, couple C's in there. Raymond flirting with a little bit of a couple of livets there too. That's good. So like I said there at the outset, I'm going to be hitting on just about everybody that's here today based on where you find yourself in regards to your growth mindset. Because as we go through the course of this, we're going to hit on each one of these. And it's so important to look at growth mindset and growth as a whole as this thing that it is something that you as a person need to be experiencing and need to be working on. But what fun is growth? What fun is growth if we're not doing it around others? We're not involving other people in the process. And then finally, what would it mean to actually practice it in a way where it's not necessarily about a destination, it's more about the process and practice itself. It becomes habitual, if you will. And we're certainly going to touch on habits as we go through this afternoon. But I've got a yes, no question as well here, just to get you thinking too, because you hear the word growth, and in my experience, I can ask 100 people what the word growth means, and I'm probably going to get 100 different answers. So I'm curious, when I say to you, when you interact with people around growth, when you think, okay, personally or professionally, do people around you see growth for the most part the same way that you see growth? Or do you find yourself feeling as though you're looking at it from a different perspective more often than not? So yes or no, you interact with people, whether it be personally or professionally, and do they see growth the same way that you see growth? Yes or no? Straight away out the starting gates, a few more no's than yes. No idea, or no idea tends to mean no. Couple of yeses, but for the most part, I'm seeing a lot of no's. All right. So it can only make me as a coach get curious straight away. Is that while you have this interpretation around you when it comes to growth, that, hey, I don't think people see it the way I see it, how clear are you on your own definition? How sure are you of what growth means to you? Now, you don't need to put that in the chat, but what I do want to make an emphasis for here is I'm a coach. And in many ways, I want you to see this as a blind coaching session today. So what you're going to notice with me is I'm probably going to have a pen in my hand this entire time, even though I might not write a single word down. It's almost my way of just sending a message to you to have that pen in your hand and to have a pad close by, so that as we're going through some of these questions that I'm just throwing at you, even if they don't warrant going in the chat, I'd like to think I'm going to be putting you through some work here this afternoon, getting you thinking a little bit outside of your comfort zone and learning a little bit about yourself in the process. So when we get to this foundation for growth, again, like I said, it can mean a variety of different things. And if you go to the dictionary right now and you type the word growth in, you're going to see a lot of these kind of definitions. And instead of me listing what these words say to you, my mind immediately just goes to vague, 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 vague. Just a ton of vague. Like maybe there's some clarity in there, maybe there's something that you connect to in there, but there's tons of room for interpretation. And yet this word growth is used all the time in our everyday. And rarely are we taking the time to just say, wait a second, are we all on the same page when it comes to the way you're using growth and the way I'm using growth? So as we go through today, as we go through my growth tool, as I'm going to introduce it to you later, that's a 100% authentically created Steve tool. And there's going to be a couple of Steve isms as we go through this. And I want to give you my definition for growth. And this is based on experience. So for me, growth is like buying your 3-year-old son a battery-powered excavator and allowing him to learn to drive it around your busy and fully furnished home. That is what growth is like to me. And I can speak from experience. There he is, my 3-year-old son, receiving that battery-powered excavator for his 3rd birthday. And boy, oh boy, did I enter a whole room of growth and growth mindset when my wife and I made that decision. And I try to act as though it was my wife and I's decision, but it may have been a lot more my decision than it was actually my wife's decision. Because what actually happened is the moment my boy sat on that excavator, I was presented with a gap that I did not know existed. And what that gap was there was this assumption of how great a gift I thought buying my son a battery-powered excavator would be. And then there was the reality. Then there was the reality of what was going to occur. This kid had no spatial awareness. This kid did not care how many walls he would chip along the way as he rounded the couch and headed towards the kitchen. So the gap that immediately I was presented with was great gift. Wait a second. On the other side of that great gift is this reality that I did not know existed. And suddenly I found myself having to face a resistance. The resistance was, do I now have to take this away? Is this something that is just great gift, wrong birthday? I have to kind of figure and battle that out now. But what was more important beyond that resistance was the level of ownership that I then had to take. No, it's too late, Steve. You can't take away this excavator. You've created this situation now. You've made your bed, and now you got to sleep in it. You've got to accept what this is. Now, I had a question to ask myself at that point. If I'm going to own this situation, then the next step is, what am I going to do about it? What am I going to do about it when it comes to the work? Am I going to allow my boy just to keep driving around the house, crashing everything in sight? Or am I going to spend a little bit of time with him, get a feel of like, hey, when you turn left, and if you do it for hard enough, eventually something comes along and you bump into it. And that might be something that I don't want you to bump into. Maybe it's me that you're bumping into. Either way, we need to work on this. So we had a bunch of work to do. And as those weeks and months went by, and he started to get a feel of what this might actually be like driving this thing around the house, we arrived at the truth. This is the piece of growth that we don't spend anywhere near enough time. And in fact, we try to avoid this thing as much as we possibly can. And we think about the truth. When we work through the G, the R, the O, and the W, we are landed with this whole abundance of truth. Think about all the work that has taken place through those first 4 stages. Now you look at the truth and you say, does this truth warrant the work that I've done? Have I learned something about myself so far that is pushing me and getting me further along in this process towards where I can finally create the habit? Because after all that time, and this was about 6 months later, I could hear this battery-powered engine motoring around the house, and I no longer heard any crashes following it as it was going around. Because what I'd done is I'd allowed myself and my son to live in the truth that this situation is what it is, and we're learning a bunch, and we're getting better at what we're doing, and we're now creating the kind of habits that are necessary to drive this thing safely around the house. Now, that is my own lived out definition of growth. And why I like giving you that is it's about the best and most accurate way that I can also describe what growth is like when you get towards optimal performance. Because I'd love a yes or no right now in the chat. Are you someone that is here today learning about growth so that you can pursue optimal performance? Or are you just simply here to learn about growth? So yes or no, are you here today to pursue optimal performance in whatever respective industry and whatever respective world you are currently operating in? Yes or no? Beautiful. Plenty of yeses flying in. That's exactly what I want to hear. And Growth mindset is an enormous piece of this. That is where we are trying to get to. And I want to be abundantly clear about that. Growth mindset is mastery. It is not the entry. Growth mindset is the mastery of growth. It is not the entry of growth. So when you look at this from the outset toward growth, we need to look at, hey, if I'm going to pursue optimal performance and I think about growth, how am I practicing growth every single day? How am I allowing for growth to happen to me every single day? How am I challenging growth every single day? How am I defining growth? We've already covered that every single day. And how are you pursuing growth each and every day? Are you asking yourself these kind of questions? Because at the core of those questions are the kind of information that will actually propel you into taking the kind of action that I am all too familiar with in my coaching world. Because it's when you get into the optimal performance space that you suddenly arrive at all these other pieces that when you look at them, what can I expect? What can I expect from growth? Well, growth is a constant. It never ever wavers. If you stop thinking about it, you stop experiencing it. So it's a constant, especially for those that are aspiring for optimal performance. And once you arrive in that vicinity of pursuing and achieving optimal performance, growth mindset is a non-negotiable. You don't get to the top. You don't get amongst the best without finding ways to actually commit and honor growth mindset in everything that you do. And as we're going to go through here over the next 30 minutes, there's a foundational practice to respect when it comes to optimal performance. It's the piece that too often we don't discuss because we're too committed to the idea of embodying growth mindset and forgetting that there are these opportunities to create foundational practice in that pursuit of optimal performance. And we have individual accountability and we have collective consistency. We want to know that within the environment that we're operating in, that at all times things are consistent so that we can have that foundation for what we're trying to create. So that's me setting the table here through the first 10 minutes or so we can get a feel of where we might be heading here in the next 30 minutes. All right. But I want you to sort of look at the growth cycle like this. All right. Now, this might seem kind of like an intimidating cycle, intimidating, just design when you first look at it. But if we look at the red area, when we talk about growth and this foundation that I'm starting to propose here, this is the fuel. This is the fuel that we're trying to put into ourselves to prepare us for those moments where our mindset is going to be tested. Now, the problem is a lot of the time, growth mindset, it's being used like this fast Ferrari in the gray, but we're handing the keys to the Ferrari to someone that's maybe never even driven a car before. We're saying, hey, here you go. Go achieve and go pursue and go live growth mindset. But we're forgetting that there's this foundational piece to growth that is so important to respect. And it starts with this idea of just pumping gas into ourselves, fueling ourselves consistently as an individual to begin with, so that we can move toward the kind of mindset that can serve us big picture at higher stakes for longer periods. And it's when we start to embody that mindset that we start to then move into these spaces collectively where we can really create the kind of culture that allows us to achieve optimal performance. And you'll see here that I've got personal and I've got performance. Okay. Now, traditionally, you may expect to see personal and professional, but I'm just curious if I were to ask you all a question now, does anybody currently see what they do not as performance? On a professional standpoint, is there anybody here that can say, in no way, Steve, am I having to perform to a certain standard? In fact, there is no evidence whatsoever of performance within the world that I operate in. I mean, I'd love to hear from you. If you feel as though you fall into that category where there is nothing about what you do that covers performance or requires elite or optimal or consistent performance, please, I'd love to see it in the chat. But otherwise, I'm going to assume that maybe the majority of us, if not all of us, are having to pursue performance within our respective worlds in some way, shape, or form each and every day. how, when you think about it, how exactly are you ensuring that you're thinking from a performance mindset? Are you giving yourself that ability to think, yes, when I show up, there are stakes, there are outcomes, and there are positions I'm trying to put myself in to perform at the best of my ability. That's the work that we're doing here today. It's going to give you that autonomy to really get comfortable asking these kind of questions and showing up as a performer in what you do as much as a professional or an employee or a manager, whatever title it is that you maybe associate yourself with. Okay, so where do we start with growth mindset? All right, we have two aspects. We have the assumption piece and the aspirational piece. Okay, so when I say assume, I'm talking about fixed mindset. I'm talking about assuming that talent is enough. Okay, that talent alone is going to get us to where it is we want to get to. And I'm talking about the assumption that maybe feedback is some form of an attack. What are you trying to say about me right now? What is it I've done wrong? When really someone might be trying to help you, might be trying to get you further along in your development. And finally, there's this desire to sometimes protect our image, to not be seen as something that requires work, to not be seen as something that is maybe a work in progress. So when we think about fixed mindset, I do have a question for all of you. All right. And this is one that I really want you to take maybe 10 or 20 seconds and write something down. What might be something in your world right now, today? Okay. And this is where the blind coaching is going to begin today. What might be something in your world today where you feel as though you might be operating with a little bit of a fixed mindset? This can be personally or professionally, something where you're maybe resistant to giving it a go, giving it a try because you feel as though you don't have the talent that's required to do those things well. Or maybe there's something that you've received consistent feedback with that's felt like an attack, as though you're not good enough, as though you're not capable enough. Or maybe there's a place where you feel as though, for whatever reason, you're trying to protect the image of yourself. And by not necessarily pursuing this thing that you could be pursuing, you have this sense that you're actually protecting your image in the process. Go ahead, take 10, 15 seconds. Maybe see if you can think of something. I want to give you an example here. For me, education. Education is a huge thing that I have a fixed mindset around. And trust me, there's a whole story to this that someday you may hear in a podcast or whatever it is about myself. But to make a very long story very short, the fact is, I have a lot of limiting beliefs and fixed mindsets around my ability to learn. And I will sometimes create these fixed mindsets that I don't have the time, I don't have the capacity. Maybe they're just not possible for me to do the educational piece. And I'm even trying to protect my image with that too. Because when we think about it, if I'm trying to protect my image, I'm probably preventing myself from even starting. Think about that, where I started us today. We're going to protect our image. We're just not going to start at all. So for me, education is a big fixed mindset piece that I continually work around, that I have a lot of these limiting beliefs speaking away in the back of my mind. I'm always trying to work through. And it's something that I'm all too aware of when I work with my clients as well. So we want to shift from this fixed mindset into this growth mindset, this aspirational mindset, this aspiration to improve and discover what is unknown. It's funny, whenever I start off with somebody in the coaching world now, I tell them there's three things that we're gonna discover as we start this coaching process. We're going to discuss the things that you know. We're going to discuss we're going to discuss the things that you don't know. And then we're also eventually going to get to the things that you don't know. And you hear that and you go, I've lost you there, Steve. But the fact of the matter is, we're trying to discover parts of ourselves that otherwise, had we not tried, they would never have been revealed. We're trying to aspire to receive the kind of feedback that can elevate our practice. Because again, growth is a practice. It's not a destination. And aspiring as well to pursue those standards, to be held accountable. What a huge part of growth mindset accountability plays. Because when we do take that time to think about it, all of a sudden, we start to raise that accountability on ourselves in a way that maybe, for whatever reason, it doesn't currently exist. So some food for thought here in terms of these general definitions. Now, before I go any further, any questions about some of these initial definitions? And usually I get questions around books and things like that. And I came prepared with that for that question today, because For anybody that knows anything about growth mindset, you would have probably read Carol Dweck's book on mindset. But there's two books that I really encourage you to read, and they both have two different reasons for it. One is the From Strength to Strength by Arthur Brooks. This is a great one for a long-term mindset of, hey, how do I perform at elite standards in the second half of life? An incredible book. And then The $1 Trillion Coach. It's a man called Bill Campbell, a very unknown guy in Silicon Valley that pretty much coached anyone who's anyone over a 25, 30-year period in that space. And he was very much a trailblazer for so much of what we're talking about here from a coaching standpoint as well. So there's 3 books right there, but I'm not seeing any questions right now. So I'll keep us moving, because the 3 C's of growth mindset that you're going to get more educated on as we go through the rest of the webinar here: curiosity, challenge, and commitment. These are my 3 C's. In fact, what I love about these 3 C's is I get to live them and experience them every single day in the work that I do. In fact, as we get into my tool here in a little bit, you're going to learn how I'm applying this in anything and everything that I not only do myself, but how I'm using it as a coach with my clients too. But curiosity is such an important piece here. You know, if you're not living with that curious mindset, it makes growth very difficult. But one thing I say to all my clients is that to be curious is one thing, but then to position yourself with that level of comfort to then be challenged around those curiosities, that's when the good stuff starts to come from growth. But finally, and this is a big piece, when it comes to the challenge, when it comes to the commitment, when you actually make commitments that reinforce this cycle, and what I mean by that is you're making a commitment that you know by achieving that commitment, you will be even more curious about the next step. That's when you are cooking. That is when great things happen around growth. Because I'm sure if you look at your to-do list right now, you'll see what you think is a whole bunch of commitments that you've got to get done by the end of today. But what if I were to say, look at that to-do list and start asking, hey, by achieving this particular task, am I pursuing growth by doing that, or am I just simply checking a box? What might 1 or 2 commitments a day look like to actually serve growth, so that the next day I wake up curious for what it is I'm trying to maybe get out of that next day? So again, the fixed mindset piece is, where are you experiencing it? All right. So you should have taken the time now, hopefully, just to identify one area of your life. Where are you experiencing this fixed mindset? And just asking yourself that question: how might those 3 C's that I just presented help just get a little bit out of that and start thinking, hey, how could I maybe be a little curious toward my fixed mindset, whatever this limiting belief is, whatever this thing I'm stuck with might look like? But, and this is what we're here for today, there's a process for growth that fuels this growth mindset that I'm excited to kind of dive into here with you now. And I really want you guys to speak up and ask questions here as we go through this. 3 C's, I can just tell you, John, I can tell you the 3 C's. The 3 C's, one is curiosity, one is challenge, and one is commitment. But don't worry about anything that you miss as well on these slides. If I for whatever reason, skip too far, Raymond will make sure that you guys get this on the back end of the webinar. So the gap and the resistance, we're going to start in the gap. Okay. We're going to start in the gap. Now, the thing with the gap, all right, is that let's cast our minds to typically around the last 1 or 2 weeks every single year. You start thinking about the year that's gone and looking towards the next year. So what do? We create a New Year's resolution, right? We create a gap in doing that. We say, hey, this is where I am, and this is where I want to get to. Okay. Now, I say a word like gap to you based in the world that you operate in currently. And I'm curious, if you got an email from me this afternoon and I said, Raymond, listen, I've been made aware of a gap regarding yourself, and I'd like to sit down and talk to you about it. 1 word answers, please, in the chat. What emotion comes to mind? All right. That's all the email says. All the email says: I've been made aware of a gap. I've been made aware of a gap of yours, and I'd like to speak to you about it a little bit later. Anxiety, scared, stressed, concern. Any other emotions that maybe jump to mind when you're thinking about this? And so the thing is with these gaps that I've noticed is that that's a really normal reaction. Those kind of emotions, 100% confused. Exactly. It's that kind of feeling of just, wait, did I do something wrong? Is there a problem here? You see, the world that I've operated in high performance, in optimal performers, high performers, they not only enjoy receiving their gaps, they actually go looking for them. They try to find their gaps. They try to find wherever it is that they can see an improvement. And the tricky part is we don't really know how to have conversations about our gaps. That is a huge question mark in a lot of these areas, because the way I kind of presented that is a very typical approach that someone might take towards a gap. I've seen a gap. I'd like to talk to you about it. We feel attacked straight away. That fixed mindset goes into overdrive, but it's human nature. It's going to happen. The question is, can we create gaps, and can we get so consistent about the creation of these gaps that we actually become accustomed to not only receiving this information, but going away and creating it for ourselves, seeing an opportunity for growth and saying there's an opportunity for growth there, and I'm going to create that gap between where I am right now and where it is I want to get to based on this certain skill set, based on this certain experience, this educational piece, this part of my physical health, my personal health, my spiritual health, whatever it may be. There are hundreds of gaps that we can potentially consider about ourselves. But the question is, how good a job are we doing at identifying them? And the reason why we want to do that is we want to get better at identifying with those gaps and finding direction in our growth. That's the power of this stuff, because we suddenly now connect to the process at the outset. But as I mentioned at the beginning, and as I see here on the title, the notion of the resistance piece, we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware of the fact that no matter how ambitious we may feel on the front end about growth, that there's always this voice talking away up there, feeling the need to speak up, feeling the need to tell us why we might not be able to do whatever it is we want to be able to do, whatever it is we want to be able to accomplish. Now, when I was working with athletes, I would always say, let's figure out the resistance and let's swim around in it. Let's get used to it. Let's discuss it so commonly that it no longer feels like a resistance, that it is now this thing that we can live with, that we can almost befriend, if you will. And when you think about maybe that thing you wrote down as a fixed mindset, you'll be able to recognize that, hey, that's a resistance. That's a limitation that I have. And for whatever reason, it's back here and I need to do some work around it. The one thing I always say to people is, when it comes to resistance, how do you find that necessity around overcoming it? Because we're practicing awareness on the front end. You're getting to know yourself more. If you don't think about this sort of thing, then you don't know it is going on. When you take the time to identify that gap and then sit still and think, what is it that's preventing me from getting started? What is that voice telling me in my mind that is preventing me from getting started? And how can I get more clear on that voice, on that resistance, spend more time with it, and do some work around it as well? Because we want to find that necessity. We want to find that necessity for actually bridging this gap that we've identified and to pursue growth. In my opinion, authenticity is the beneficiary of this. And authenticity is this word that we're always trying to figure out, it feels as though, in corporate America. You may not realize this, but authenticity is not a current state. It is not a version of you that's formed. It's a version of you that is forming. We need to be aspirational about the way in which we pursue authenticity. You need to understand that nothing about how you are today is necessarily going to be how you end up at the end of this growth process. Everything about you could evolve. Everything about you could change in time. And so the comfort that you have in pursuing that version of yourself is actually the greatest way that you can pursue authenticity. And I'm hoping that you can start to see here, as I talk through this, you're laying the foundation for curiosity. You're identifying gaps and you're getting familiar. You're creating awareness for yourself. That's a practice in itself. So are you getting consistent with the creation of the gaps? And are you practicing getting comfortable with resistance. And the more you do that, the more you're getting to know yourself. But that's an act of curiosity in every single way. And you get so comfortable with it in a way that there's really nothing that you start to shy away from, but it is a practice. You have to start small, and slowly over time, you can start to figure these things out more productively. Okay, before I move on, anything around authenticity, anything around gaps or resistance before I move on to ownership? Any questions that jump out at this point? So we're going to really get into a little bit more of the blind coaching piece here. Okay, because we've got the ownership piece, and then we're going to get to the work as well. I'm going to have a sentence for you guys to fill out that I'm excited for you to be able to practice this, because this is where some of the greatest amount of growth takes place. Because when we start to own what it is that we do, suddenly now we get more comfortable in the work. Okay, but I'd love to know if anybody's experienced this in their career at any point. Someone's come up to your desk, or someone sent you an email and they've said, so and so, I've got some work that I need you to take ownership for. All right, here's the work, and I need you to take ownership for it. Give me a yes, give me a thumbs up, give me a fire emoji, give me anything here in the chat that you think where you can maybe resonate with that happening to you at any point. Here's the work, and I want you to take ownership for it, as opposed to, as we're going to discover here, maybe doing it the other way around. Maybe that's happened to you a few times over the years. This notion of, hey, here's the work, and I want you to take ownership for it. All right. The key here is that when we can build ownership on the front end, the work becomes so much more of a natural decision. It's a decision that people make. And that in itself, going back to the authenticity part of this, that is what you want people to start establishing. And that's what you want for yourself too. What would it mean for you to actually build ownership in a way to where you can connect and see relevance in the work that you eventually start to do? Because that's one of the most frustrating pieces when we think about work sometimes, especially when we're dealing with growth, is, are we doing this in a way where we feel as though we're seizing ownership for what comes with the eventual work, with the growth that lies ahead of us? So when we move from ownership into the work, well, now we can start to make that work something that we care a little bit more about. We can personalize it, and we can justify it. Think about adversities that come your way. Maybe work sometimes falls into that same category as adversity. You sit there and you think, why am I doing this? Why am I in this situation? What is going on right now? You start asking outward questions about the work. You don't stop and think, how can I take ownership for the situation that I'm in right now? And maybe that's not a fair question to ask you when you've been put in that situation. So let's make this about your own individual growth. How might owning the process of growth, how might the ownership of that influence the type of work you choose to do? Whether you're someone who's working on getting fitter, you're working on improving that diet, you're working on implementing that habit around the clock, whatever it may be. What if you were to take ownership of that process on the front end and then start to figure out ways that you could actually do the work on the back end? Because we're trying to build a level of respect, build a level of respect so that you value your investment and that you recognize the willingness that goes into the work itself. Now, what's important here is that you're laying that foundation to be challenged. Okay. The notion of ownership and work allows you to take on being challenged, which is why I want you to look at that initial fixed mindset that you wrote down at the beginning. And I want you to now look at this statement of ownership and work and ask yourself this very, in my opinion, very straightforward question that sometimes causes a lot of discomfort for people, because it is ownership. All right. But this is the best way I can make an example of this. All right. Looking at this, you say, I am ready to take ownership for. When you look at that fixed mindset piece, I am ready to take ownership for. And you fill in the blank. whether it's the fixed mindset that you have, whether it's the gap that naturally makes sense to create based on that fixed mindset. And then the next part of the statement is to honor this, I will work on. So you're identifying the work straight away. You're stepping into immediate ownership because you've taken ownership for something and now you're seeing a stepping stone, some exercise, some action point that you can implement. And then finally, which means you can all expect me to, and that is the accountability piece right there, which means you can all expect me to, even if you don't share that with anybody, just simply answering finishing the sentence, sorry, with that, it gives you a little bit more of a destination. It gives you a little bit more of direction in terms of where it is you're trying to go. And again, now when you maybe look at that thing where you maybe connect with fixed mindset on the front end, how does a statement like this influence the perception you have for the likelihood that you can overcome that fixed mindset and maybe even start to bridge a gap between where you are right now and where you feel as though you're capable of getting? All right, with just about 10 minutes left here, and want to make sure we have enough space for questions at the end too. But here's the fun piece. Now, the first four pieces that I talked about here, the gap, the resistance, the ownership, and the work. What's great about those is that you can go away today and start working on that. You just saw that sentence that you filled out. You can make some action points and you can feel as though you're taking greater ownership for what you do right now, right here. The truth and the habit, that takes time. It takes time for that to show itself. You don't find and come to the truth, and you certainly don't establish the habit in a day, in a week, sometimes in a month. It can take that long. But by approaching growth with those first four steps of the growth acronym, you find yourself in a place where when you actually do get to the truth, you're respecting that data. You're respecting that information. Maybe you have a month's worth of evidence now saying, hey, I set off on this goal. I had this gap that I was trying to bridge. And having done this for 4 weeks, for a month, however long it may be, I can now confidently say, based on the information that I've gathered in the last month, either I was honest and serious about the gap that I created, or maybe I was selling myself a little short. Maybe I was capable of more. Or maybe I wasn't being honest to myself. Maybe I've been saying that I want this all this time, but deep down, turns out I actually don't want this anywhere near as badly as I thought I did. Now, that information is difficult to receive. It's difficult to realize. But when we do the work on the front end, we are so much more willing to listen to that information. Because when we live in the truth, we understand that we've actually established commitment, that we've taken ownership for the work that we've done. That one of the biggest issues that I see so often in folks when I first start coaching them is that they want to jump right to the truth. They want to get right into the honesty. And while that can serve you in some cases, a lot of the time we're not quite ready to get into the weeds that comes with the truth, that comes with that body of evidence, that when we sit down and we look at it, it says, wow, I have nowhere to hide. I cannot avoid this feedback. I cannot avoid this information. This is telling exactly how it is. And I am curious enough, comfortable enough with challenge, and easily capable to make commitments to where I can actually process information. That takes time to get used to receiving that level of feedback. That's why the first four steps of this are so important. And for any leaders on this call, it's why I really encourage you to consider, how are you implementing the first four steps of growth before you start to get into the truthful, honest feedback that somebody is potentially receiving. Because finally, and this is what we want to get to, right? We want to build the habit. Okay, we want to get across that finish line and say, yes, I am improved. I have established a habit. I have established a routine. I am in a place now in life where I feel as though this particular gap that I was set off to bridge, I've got it down. I feel that bridge is just about complete, and I'm feeling really good about myself. The beauty is that the habit, it's a recognition piece, and it's a way to set new expectations as well. When I say recognition is one of the top 3 things that we as employees are looking for in the office, in the workplace. If it's not coming for whatever reason, Can we get better at just simply recognizing our own growth, our own efforts, the own habits that we've built over time? And how are those habits now raising expectations for what we believe about ourselves? Now, I want to just show you, or before I get to that, sorry, I just want you to understand that the power here of alignment when we form this lasting relationship with yourself and we find comfort with the discomfort. Okay. You hear terms like that all the time, this notion of, hey, I want to find comfort in the discomfort. I want to get better at just simply being uncomfortable. I get that part of this. But what ends up happening so often when we think about gaps and when we think about habits, that's kind of how we typically go about it. We establish the gap like a New Year's resolution, and we try to go all the way to the habit and we try to implement it. And yet the data says 92% of people that set those New Year gaps, if you will, don't see them through to the end because we don't do the work in between. We don't face the resistance. We don't take ownership. We don't do the right kind of work and we don't get comfortable in the truth. And we wonder why we can't find alignment in the work that we do and in the way that we grow because we want to build a lasting relationship with ourselves. I say this to people all the time. You spend no more time with anybody else on this planet than you do yourself. So if you can't be in alignment with what you want and what you need, you have some work to do. That's fine. That's where the fun stuff begins, in my opinion. But you're laying the foundation for commitment. That's that third piece now of growth mindset. It's that catalyst for pursuing growth. Yeah. And you want to be able to repeatedly set to ensure you drive further curiosity. I said that at the outset. What good is a commitment if by achieving it, it's not bringing you right back around to starting this cycle all over again? Now, as we start to finish here, it's amazing how quick an hour can go. But as we start to finish here, the foundation for growth, you see it all right here in front of you. Okay. When we create the right gap and the right resistance, we build authenticity and we become curious. When we have ownership in work, we build respect for ourselves, most importantly, and we get more comfortable with the challenge. And then when we have the truth in the habit piece too, we find this inner alignment with ourselves. And it gets us way more comfortable creating these commitments as we go through our process. And I just like putting this little piece here just to share with you because I think it's important when you see it put this way. You know, a growth-minded culture is actually possible. It will naturally form within an organization. If you have 10 people in an office that are all pursuing growth individually like this, your culture will be growth-minded before you know it. If you're doing this across an enormous organization, it's the exact same. When you pursue individual growth this way, growth culture, growth-minded culture specifically, almost becomes inevitable because people are getting more and more comfortable with their own growth process. And I'm a coach. So how can I not put this in some form of explanation that almost feels like a little bit of a workout? Okay. If there's any questions around this whole process of growth that I presented, I want you to just simply look at your own individual growth like this. Train it, test it, trust it. Okay. Start by training it. Get some reps in. Those reps are building that foundational piece so you can start to consider what it might mean to embody a growth mindset. And don't be afraid to test it. That's what the ownership and the work piece is. We're not only getting the repetitions, but then we're going to put ourselves out there a little bit and we're going to test ourselves. We're going to maybe make a couple of bold statements in front of friends and say, hey, not only am I getting in shape, guys, you know what? I'm kind of fancying a 5K this Christmas. I think I'm going to do a 5K this Christmas. Yeah, I'm going to give it a go. And so you test yourself. But by the time you've maybe gotten to a point where you're so comfortable testing it, by God, you're going to start trusting it. You're going to get so comfortable knowing that this process works and you're going to live it, you're going to breathe it, and you're going to absolutely trust it. And trust in itself, in addition to these other two pieces of the growth muscle, it allows you to feel ready, which is really my final message here today, is what it means to feel ready for growth. I always asked athletes when I was working in elite sport, right before they would go up for a race, are you ready? And if I didn't get a heck yeah, coach, I probably followed up with at least some form of insight to get them in a better headspace. But more often than not, my athletes came to me to expect that question because they needed to know by speaking it out loud that they were in fact ready. And when you think about that gap that you're maybe thinking about through the course of this webinar, are you ready to bridge that gap right here, right now, today? If you're not, that's okay. But what might some of this work do for you to feel a greater sense of readiness as you start to take on and consider approaching the bridging of this gap, working through this growth and getting clearer on what it might mean to embody a growth mindset? All right. Now, like most things, I want to be able to help you far beyond the webinar. All right. And what I will say is that it might be best just to wait until the the PowerPoint is shared following the webinar to get all this information, mainly because this QR code, I encourage you to use it. Feel free to do it. This is kind of my plan B because I had a little bit of a letdown with some technology earlier in the day. But this will take you to a type form where you can provide me that very ownership work statement that you hopefully will have written during the course of this. So whatever that 3-part sentence was, again, if you've forgotten what it was and you were paying attention and you weren't writing it down, no problem. You'll be able to see the PowerPoint come through at some point, and you can maybe go ahead and write that down. Send that to me either through the type form or through the QR code that should be ready for you by the time you receive this. And I'm going to send you this PDF. This PDF is so powerful. I use it and have used it multiple times just this week. And I'll give you a very short story because I know we're getting towards the end. But on Tuesday alone, I had a workshop. I had a 2.5-hour group coaching session, and then I had a one-on-one coaching session. And the growth tool played an enormous part in every single piece of that day. And it's quite reaffirming for me as someone who's worked on this and created this and gotten it to a point now where it is so cohesively effective that no matter the situation, no matter the scenario, there's an opportunity for an individual to stop, reflect, and do this work. Wherever you find yourself in this process, these questions, these insights, these thoughts, they're a catalyst. They're a catalyst to get you thinking a little bit about how you can move through this process. Okay. So, with all that being said, I appreciate your time at this point. I just wanted to show you this one last time and keep this on the page while I take any questions.
All right, Steve, thank you so much. And John, really appreciate your comment there. I know Steve
Yeah, thank you, John.
appreciates it. Yeah, so Steve, I'm going to kick it off with a question, and if anyone has questions, please post them in the chat. Within our company, we have a leadership and executive coaching practice, and by the way, the growth acronym just resonates 100%. I love the whole idea of the gap, resistance, ownership piece, and we have some tools in our practice where we identify the gaps through a management assessment, a self-assessment. We get to a place where there's alignment on the gaps, where the leaders maybe thrusted into a role, and there's some competencies that we want to focus on. The thing that I'm curious about is the ownership piece. So we identify the plan, and the leader signs the plan, the HR person signs the plan, the individual signs it, like everyone, and that's sort of like the ownership. But I'm wondering, like you kind of shared some inspiring words around, a race and being ready, and are you ready to go?
Mm-hmm.
What's like, are there other qualitative things that you do around the ownership that really like that person feels like they're ready? You know what I'm saying? It's not just lip
Yeah.
service where they say, yep, I know I got to be more self-aware, or I need to work on this or work on that. And they signed it and there's a plan and they're going to start working with their coach. But like, how much more ownership can that person like, how do you convey that in a way that you feel like they really are invested in their growth? Like, I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I love the question. And what's funny is I I do workshops on every single one of these words. And so like when someone asks me a question like that, I want to go right into my 90-minute workshop on on ownership. But what I'll say here real quick is when we talk about ownership, you want people to sit there and say, okay, what's in this for me? what's in this for me,
Mm,
first and foremost, because the what's in this for me immediately pulls them into this where it's like, wait, they're part of this outcome. Yes, it may be a team thing, as you said there, Raymond, all these different people signing off on certain things. But when we ask a question like, what's in this for me, we actually acknowledge the stakes too. We acknowledge the stakes. We say, listen, I'm responsible for this result. And so, again, going back to some of that insight with athletes, to sit there with an athlete and say, at the beginning of the year, not when we get to the competition, it's too late to take ownership at that point, but at the
yep,
beginning of the year, to sit there and for me to look across at them. And instead of me asking, like, how fast do you want to go this year? Or what do you want to achieve this year? I always used to love asking those kind of questions. Like, what's in this for you this year? Like, what's going to be that thing that you get out of this season that I will never be able to understand, and none of your teammates will be able to understand. Because if you can answer that question, then we can get to the heart of your why. We can get to the heart of your why in those moments when you're maybe a little resistant, when you fall back into the resistance, because it is a series. And typically when ownership does waver, we fall back into the resistance. And so asking that kind of question on the front end, Raymond, of just saying, hey, what's in this for me, to be able to ask that question to yourself. But as a leader, if you're ever in that kind of room, to have the comfort of asking a similar question to that room and saying, guys, what's in this for us, but what do each of you think is in this for you? Because that's going to tell me the level of ownership that you want to take in this process.
great. Love that. Appreciate it. All right, I see a lot of comments that have come in here, saying thank you, great webinar, great session. Steve, do you have a closing slide where people can get in touch with you?
I do, yeah. You can. This is me. In this day and age, if I don't get a few Instagram followers off the back of this, I've failed. But the yeah, I mean, and again, when it comes to reaching out and just inquiring more about anything that I do, but more specifically, even that PDF, if you just want to send me how you've maybe responded, or how this has resonated with you as we've gone through this webinar today. I'm a people person. I want to hear from people directly, so feel free to reach out anyway through any of these methods.
Great. And you'll be in Chicago next month at the annual SHRM conference.
Yes,
So
I will.
definitely look up Steve if you're attending the conference next month. And yeah, would love to, we'll see you in Chicago. And as I mentioned, we're going to send out the presentation, the webinar recording. So you'll have all this information. You'll have access to the QR code. And Steve, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
You're so welcome. Lynn, Jody, thank you. Eddie, thank you so much. I appreciate